Okay, so welcome. I'm actually going to interject a different session. Basically, from my normal things on philosophy, I'm going to go into the American state papers, and in particular, one I've just written about, Federalist Number 10, which was from one of my favorites, Madison, not everyone's, but basically covers the formation of many of the constitutional freedoms that we have now. So Federalist Number 10, Madison's one of the main instigators of all of this, and Federalist papers are really a series of arguments in public over, not heated or anything like this, but conversations going back and forwards, logically analyzing the foundation of the Constitution of the United States, how it should be put together, etc. So this is an essential part of understanding the problems behind any government. This is instability, strife fractions, etc. The known difficulties that anyone will have, and how they can be addressed. So in this, Madison was looking at a variety of alternatives. The discourse between each of these areas occurred over sort of journalistic debates in newspapers from 1787 to 1789 in particular. And anyone in the American colonies, then America as a sort of society, could sort of look at what was happening and even potentially engage. Now, Publius is the actual name of Virgil, so this is something many people don't know. Publius is references some of the origins of the Greco-Roman form of sort of government, and this is also linked into some studies I'm doing at the moment, hence where this is, and I've put this together as a little adjunct. It's one that I find is actually very important. Now, I'll write more on Federalist Number 47 and others later, but Federalist Number 10 is one that I particularly like. So Madison, for instance, describes, and I've got that written down here, the problem facing government. We saw that in France afterwards, and some of the conclusions of the experiment they had. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by superior force of interested and overbearing majority. Now, this is something that people don't always think about. The overbearing majority could be the 51%. So in Federalist Number 10, Madison's looking at how do we protect minorities? How do we protect, if say 80% of the government want to destroy what is out there? How do we protect this smaller aspect of society from the majority? And demagoguery is something that was considered. So number 10, we understand US citizenship in this. It gives us a little bit of clarity around how the American government was actually formed. And in this series of discourses, we can see the debate that was happening in the early republic. So Madison wanted to combat the idea of political instability. This was a big issue because we see France and all that was happening there, and many people felt betrayed with the French government. Even Catherine, the Empress in Russia, did a full sort of turnaround later and reversed some of the more open liberal policies because of France. So it has arguments combined from many others, and it addresses each of these. And it is incredibly important when looking at the development of the American system. So the Declaration of Independence is mostly the work of Thomas Jefferson. It, of course, balances many other aspects of government and what people said. But the Federalist Papers then combine the arguments of Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. The father of the Constitution, Madison was one of the many who helped write this, and 9 of the 13 states were required to sort of implement and ratify this document. New York was one of the last, so it had to be convinced. So New York only by a very narrow margin, 30 to 27, ratified the Constitution in 1788. And part of this process was the consistent argument here between each of these people, going how we need to build a balanced system. Now, Jefferson there was more of a small government, but equally, I guess you would say, government in the hands of the people. Madison, on the other hand, wanted something other than direct democracy. In the size of something like the US, this becomes impractical, so it keeps the country small. Madison wanted the country to grow, to be larger, to implement new states. And this separation of powers that developed, the bicameral agreements between the lower and upper house, for instance, the Congress and the Senate, developed to help protect those areas. So as Madison says, the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves. So this is why we have people vote for someone else who then votes, or the electoral college, etc. So the concept is to have statesmen, someone who is not just acting on the whim of the moment, the local breeze that blows through, which differs from old Jefferson there, who really looked at the people and said, we need to trust them and we need to be less paternalistic. So Madison implemented a number of systems in this, arguing that we want to ensure that we protect society from itself. So malfunctioning government, and it can be a factional problem. Some of these factions we see now because of parties. So Madison actually wanted to reduce the factions, the groups of citizens which control the government for their own good, and to sort of divide things up. So we can eliminate the cause of factions or control their effects. Now, Jefferson had the argument that we just eliminate them, but I also don't believe that's possible. I'm more aligned with Madison in controlling the effects of those things, controlling the parties. I think they're going to always evolve. I don't think we can train people not to see any of this. So what I really believe is that we, like Madison, need to implement something to limit the power of those who control, well, right now control social media, control the media generally.
Would you say, Craig, sorry to interrupt, but
yes,
would you say it's almost devolved now into like a two-party factionalism, like an almost extremified factionalism?
Yes, very much. And
just two factions.
We've also seen a lot of the move towards pure democracy and demagoguery that Madison didn't want. So the concept of representatives in the Electoral College has been removed, which this is one of the other quotes, of course, from Madison in 10, which is refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of the chosen body of citizens, those whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. So in this, what we're thinking about is someone who is a statesman, someone who is a supporter of long-term growth and a love of their country. A Washington, really. So President Washington was exactly this. Unfortunately, we have a lot of others now who take different sort of perspectives, but it really is a balance of ruling power. So we don't want party politics, but we can't get rid of them. So what we're seeking to do is balance them and limit the effect that they have. Now, without being able to limit party factions, how do we do this? How do we implement something that will lead the government into a system that won't destroy levity? So Madison notes that factions will always be with us. And I think this is an important aspect to remember. Social psychology, which is rather commonly studied these days, is going to tell us that, well, people are going to form cliques, tribes, etc. We see this on social media now. And to think that we can control that, I think is rather, well, naive, to be very simple. Yeah. So the Republican form of government is the freest and most liberal option. Now, this doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want. It's a balance between the rights of the property owners, the people wanting to do things with other people's like goods, etc. And it's always a balance. So democracy needs to be tempered in this. It means rather than, well, someone gets on social media, someone gets on Twitter, someone gets angry and stirred up, maybe we sit back and think about it and apply a little bit of wisdom and reason. And by doing this, we form delegations that we see and we complain to them, and they go up there and they, well, take our ideas and put them forth in a less enthusiastic manner, you might say. The greater number of citizens also is a possibility. The extension of the country, and we've seen that, of course. The United States is far bigger than the original 13 states. So the concept of the Roman senator was important. The tribune in Rome acted to manage the people, to act as someone voted in and represent them. And that was balanced against the Senate. So it's a little bit different from the Roman idea in that there's a proper constitutional sort of allocation of rights, not just a few tribunes, but a complete Congress. And these individuals now represent, well, the people much more than even Rome did. So it then creates an idea of a growing federal union, but with separations of powers, allowing everything to balance and no one to have too many powers. So not a highly powerful president, for instance, not a highly powerful Congress, not a judiciary that is active in changing law, although unfortunately this has changed. So when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. I mean, we see that. We see people wanting to extend the power of the presidency, for instance. Imagine where that goes. If you consider different examples, the power of the presidency in Russia, for instance, has been extended. And where does that end? Where do you end it? So the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good if pronounced by the people themselves. Again, stating this concept of balance of, well, taking out the emotion, the angst, the anger, the instant gratification that many have, and trying to slow down some of the concepts, to think about it so that demagoguery and mass control doesn't happen. A populist government doesn't just move people through emotional, through the pathos.
Would you agree, though, that it does kind of then allow a government to emerge that is not in service of the people and really only in service of itself? Because that's how I feel things have really evolved, is that you've got people now who have been in their positions for many years, and really they're not really focused on anybody outside of their little circle anymore.
Well, in part, this comes down to extensions of the power of the bureaucracy in the 20s, etc., by Wilson. Wilsonian government actually wanted to take the politics out of, well, general public service. And the problem with that is we now have growing government that has no control. And equally, the judiciary has been slowly eroded. We've seen that in the 30s, the changes to the Supreme Court, the growing power of the presidency. Power is something that, of course, wants to attract more power. And the concept of this sort of mix of separation and separated powers was really to balance and limit the amount of power. Now, as we get into wars, World War II, for instance, we see more and more power in the hands of a few people, and new sort of legislation that increases the amount of what people can do. The size of the government grows. So yes, more power, more control. It never goes away. That's the problem. As we implement something, we don't implement we're going to review this in 5 years and check whether we think we need it. Get rid of that part of public service. Unfortunately, what we end up with is the creation of larger and larger government over time. So now, as had been said, Madison noted that the same opinions, same passions, and same interests if held by every citizen would basically create a system that wasn't going to be divided, or we wouldn't have any notion of party politics. Of course, that's never going to happen, very simply. It's infeasible. We're never going to get 10 people from different areas in a room and expect them to have the same idea. So what we basically need to remember is people will always factionalize. People will form groups. People will start arguing with each other and forming cliques and other things. That's always how it works. So we seek to try and find a balanced system, and this balanced system of we the people is not merely the people. It could be really something that we're trying to find that goes further. For instance, it incorporates all of the notions of liberty so that we can control it. So it could never be, to quote again, it could never be more truly said than of the current remedy, that it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an element without which is instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of ourselves, of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts fire to its destructive agency. So just as we don't want to get rid of air because, well, without air we have no fire, so nothing burns, well, we die. we also don't want to remove liberty, even though it causes problems and factions, etc. We don't want to control them.
You can see what a government does when they really want to stop that from happening, and that's when you get into that situation of where they're banning groups of more than 3 people from assembling and things like that, in order just to prevent you meeting to discuss what your faction might even
does that not mean that the government then are therefore worried that the people have now become aware of something maybe they shouldn't have done? Because I mean, if you're you're only limited to 3 people, then surely they're getting scared of people in numbers. Why else would you implement that?
It's more about control. So rather than sort of thinking about it, there could be problems. Well, how about we address them properly? How about we try and talk things through? We actually teach and educate people. So all this takes time, but right now, one of the problems I will say is that people don't understand the fundamentals. So not only are we looking at a society that, well, I mean, even America, there are many people who don't have any idea of the Federalist Papers. They haven't read them. It's their foundation, and yet they have not done this. It should be something that everyone does in high school. So it should be, but it's not.
The other thing, because you just mentioned like school, that they wrote this without any consideration for the Native Americans that were already living on the land. So they were already a small faction of people.
Yes, but the answer at the time would be they wouldn't consider them citizens. So I'm not saying that's right, but the majority of Native Americans were just not considered citizens, and they were screwed over in a number of ways, usually by being tricked into treaties and other sort of allotments of land by agreement, and sometimes even one group would sort of sell things they didn't have. I mean, an example of that would be Manhattan Island. The people who sold Manhattan probably didn't have any rights to actually do that. But then you just go, well, we own it now. We bought it for a bunch of beads and other money, and it's ours. So now, ruling power within government should also not be factional. To quote old Madison there again, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mysteries of faction. A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. Communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention. So the idea here is that people will get rid of the Socrates of society. Remember way back in our first session, we talked about Socrates being a gadfly. Well, they got rid of him. The Greek, Athenian government at the time was very much a pure democracy. It didn't last that way, and it went back and forwards between democracy, oligarchy, etc. That's why, in part, the Romans implemented a Senate and a variety of different levels of control. But what we do have is a very sort of cogent and clear example of this. We have Socrates being sacrificed because, well, the majority of people don't like him. What's he done? Well, nothing that bad other than being annoying, really. So think about what the demagogic leader can actually do. So Republican is balanced. It's not wholly going to be democratic. It is meant to be a limited democracy. The reason is it's meant to temper our passions. And not all of us can show our passions correctly. So we want a small number of citizens elected by the rest so that we can implement things. We don't want them changing every year, so like some people say, because nothing will ever get done. But it's a balance. And in part, what we saw was a system where the Senate changed not all at once, but as an overlap, also to sort of limit some of the problems. So, statesman. What do you think a statesman really is?
Someone who understands not just their own system of government, but systems of government as a whole, understands the intent of the system of government that they are part of overseeing, and can come up with ways of managing the people and the resources of that nation within that system of government that they're working. So somebody who's really at quite a high level of ability, a bit of a generalist, who can really see how, pulling which lever will have which effect more broadly, economically and through that society. That's kind of what I would say.
Yeah, so I'd agree with all that. And the statesman is someone who doesn't just act because his constituents say so. He or she thinks through all of the options, thinks through what is the best course for the long run. So it is someone who is not a mouthpiece of the people, but actively uses wisdom and thought to create a system that will survive and withstand many of the ills that we'll see in the short term. So it's something that, to again quote Madison, will enable the joining of the nation, extend this sphere, and you take a greater variety of parties and interests, and you make it less probable that the majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or if such a common motive exists, it will be difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. So again, we don't want the majority to act against the minorities. Now, something people don't think about is, although Hitler became a dictator, or even Stalin, Hitler was voted into power. He used a lot of the problems at the time to extend his power, but that's an example of a demagogue. Hitler, with a majority, oppressed quite a number of minorities. So this separation of the parts of government needs to be balanced. So Madison really built upon many of the ideas of both Locke and Montesquieu, but I'll even say Montesquieu more. Madison references Montesquieu in Federalist 47, and there are disputes about the authorship of 47, but it looks at the spirit of the laws, where Montesquieu says, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, or the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner, as we said before. And again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power cannot be separated from the legislative and executive. Where we joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be legislator. Were joined to the executive power, the judge would behave with violence and oppression. And also on this point, Madison notes that one of the principal objections inculcated by the more respectable adversaries to the Constitution and its supposed violation of the political maxim that the legislative, executive, and judicial departments ought to be separate and distinct. So again, we want to limit the power of any one part of government so that they check and balance and act in the self-interest of all of the citizens as a nation. And that's an important part. So people forget this sort of balance that we're talking about. Now, this also brings us into a famous sort of quote that many people don't remember. Reddish and Caesar, and also Federalist Papers 51, brings us to, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and the next place, oblige it to control itself. So this is a key aspect. Not only do we want sort of the control to be limited, but we need to have checks and balances, and we need, as again Madison states, in the extent and proper structure of the union, therefore, we behold a republican remedy for the diseases most incident to republican government. So very simply, we need to balance all of the different aspects and the factions. So towards this, if we think about what people say about democracy, remember Hamilton actually noted this in the early days. There have been almost as many popular as royal wars. Democracy does not stop war. It doesn't always have the sort of staying power to keep fighting them, but there are many popular wars that have occurred. Just because you're in a democracy, it doesn't stop it. And to finally take a quote from Hamilton, from actually paraphrasing Abbé de Marbley, neighboring nations are natural enemies of each other unless the common weakness forces them into a league and a confederate republic, and their constitution prevents the differences at neighborhood occasions, extinguishing that secret jealousy which disposes of all states to aggrandize themselves at the expense of the neighbors. So what we're saying here is, unless people need to bind together to protect themselves, to be stronger, then naturally people actually start fighting. And there were even instances in the early American Republic where different states were, different colonies were having trouble with each other. The Americans actually had a small war with the Canadians, trying to both bring them in and get rid of the British, etc. So remember, it's not so simple as going, oh, we're now a group. Think about Texas versus New York versus California. If we don't have a system to control the disputes, then disputes get out of all proportion. So Madison wanted to avoid the evils of factions, knowing that they would be there. And this is how we unite. In uniting, we hopefully form a common interest that, well, binds us together for a common good. So I thought I'd bring this one in, the references, etc. And yeah, just do something a little bit different in our sessions. And
I'd love to know what the definition is that he believed angels were, because that puts a whole different spin on where he's coming from.
Madison was Protestant, so I mean, he wasn't like Jefferson, who was more of a deist. He was fairly much very different to many Presbyterians today, but so hard to explain it, but very much a sort of person of his time as a believer who strongly saw God, angels, etc. And in saying this, then what we're really looking at is perfection. If people were perfect, if angels, as the representatives of God, who had no flaws, could come down and represent humanity.
But how could an angel have no flaws if, like, he took the angel from heaven because, you know, he did wrong to God? Therefore, you know, angels have flaws. But also, like, if it's an angel and he believes in a higher power, then mainly, like with the Native Americans, they believed in, like, the gods came down from the heavens, so they would be aliens. So, like, I'm just wondering what kind of mindset they would have been in that period of time. And you're thinking along the kind of biblical kind of,
well, this is
pure, I mean,
but we're talking about people who are Protestant Christians, not I mean, ones who would go to church every week.
Yeah, the way I kind of read that is he's saying that if, you know, the angels are beings without fallibility. If we could entrust the governance of people to somebody higher than people who we could really trust not to make any mistakes, we wouldn't need this system of checks and balances. But really, we don't have those entities. Maybe they don't exist. Maybe
in a perfect world,
but they're certainly not here helping us do this. And so, because we don't have them, we must do all of these other things to make sure that we don't allow this to go off the rails through this factionalism.
Yeah, in a perfect world. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. If we had a perfect world, then this is sort of something we wouldn't need. If we had these perfect administrators of justice, these perfect people who, like Athena, could step in and decide for us, as we saw in some of our earlier plays and different sessions, then fine. But we don't. And this is the point. It's people with all our fallibilities, all our foibles, all our sort of emotional lack of wisdom, our emotional lack of response. So remember, going back, if we look at Socrates again, why should a group of people vote for his death? Think about this for a moment. I mean, we're voting to kill someone because he's annoying. Do we want a society where the democracy is that strong that it can just vote someone to death because, well, they're annoying me? I mean, in this modern age of sort of social justice warriors, is that a good thing to
that would be
allow people to? I agree.
It is extreme, isn't it?
Because I mean, really, there was nothing that they could point to that he did wrong. They sort of trumped up a bunch of charges around corrupting youth and, you know, saying things we don't like.
Thinking.
And
free will.
Yes, using his brain and babbling the output. And they didn't like that at all.
Yeah, asking questions.
Yeah,
asking questions.
Constantly annoying people by going, well, that's not right. I mean, if you think this through, you'll find that you've got a contradiction in what you're saying. Well, I'd be dead.
Yeah.
So, if we think about it for a moment.
So you've got to have. So essentially, what they're trying to say is we can't just let every decision be by the populace. So that there's got to be that kind of that filter, that low pass filter, or whatever you want to call it, that sort of lowers the frequency of that sort of the action that's taken. But then there's got to be a way of sort of minimizing the factionalization of that part. And, you know, you can sort of see that's where it broke down. Or it's, I mean, it hasn't completely failed, obviously, but you can see that it's now become, in that part, it's it's now become so divided. I saw there was a really interesting chart where it showed over the last sort of 80 years how partisan has been the vote on various different pieces of legislation. And you can see back in the 30s, 40s, right up to the sort of 60s and 70s, it was very much that legislation would be quite bipartisan. You'd have people from both parties voting one way or the other, dependent on what they were being told by their constituents. And over the last kind of 20 or 30 years, it's really drawn back into this almost perfectly partisan divide, where if you propose this legislation, it doesn't matter what's in it, doesn't matter what it says, I'm either going to vote for it or against it because I'm blue or red. And it's a pretty interesting evolution. Part of the problem is, I think, the way they elect the president, it encourages it to become factionalized because there's only the two candidates from the two major parties. You know, you can have the independent candidates, but it's very hard for them to get, you know, any kind of traction.
Parties and factionalization started very early. So it's interesting that it didn't even last terribly long. All right. I think that's probably enough for tonight.
Thank you very much, Craig.
I hope you enjoy and have a good read of the Federalist Papers. They're well worth understanding.
I didn't realize there were so many. I'm just looking through. There's 85 of them.
I know.
They were quite short.
Not all of them as good as the others, but yeah, they're not terribly long. So,
so if you get this Great Britannia book, they're all in there.
Is they all in one book?
Yeah. So the Britannia is good. The great sort of book series. It puts everything out there in one place. So.
Better than the Harvard Classics, actually. The Harvard Classics tend to take a subset. So with Plutarch, they have a whole book of Plutarch, but it's only about a third of the actual stories, whereas the Britannia one has the whole lot. So
does it? Okay.
Yeah.
And they're not that expensive. If you can find.
I got these for $9 so each. So yeah, you can find them very cheaply. Yeah.
And the thing is, Britannica is actually like people look at the encyclopedia and go, it's no good because it's not getting updated anymore. But there's no updates to the great books. I'm sorry. The work of Plutarch is going to be the work of Plutarch. The Aeneid will be the Aeneid. So all this stuff, it doesn't change. Well, it doesn't need to change. And if it is changing, there's a problem. So there you go. Okay. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you
very much. You too, Craig.